download it, and it's only with it's all right.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everybody and thank you for coming out to our strategic planning workshop. With us to facilitate the workshop is the Strategic Advisory Group. I'd like to introduce to you Dan Fenton and Bethany Parker, who will be facilitating the workshop. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Well, thanks everybody. Just to reintroduce ourselves, I'm Dan Fenton and Bethany Parker here at Strategic Advisory Group, and just a little bit about us. We have been in existence for about the last 20 years as a firm, and probably work in somewhere around 200 to 250 different destinations throughout our history. If you sort of look us up, we're a firm that looks at tourism issues, but from many different angles. So we are involved with strategic planning like we are here in assignments. We're also involved with looking at tourism assets and trying to figure out how they get funded, how they get built, how they get developed. We also are involved in situations where we're trying to work on the future of a particular district of a city. So we do planning like that, where it's sort of tied to economic development sometimes and tourism, trying to figure out where a particular part of a destination may go. We do a little bit of work in community branding, where we try to understand what communities are thinking in particular and how that would translate into messaging and direction and that sort of thing. And we look at strategic planning as an opportunity to kind of bring a lot of that together and do a lot of that and try to learn a lot and ultimately come out with recommendations that will be helpful. And when we typically do tourism strategic planning, our goal is to come out of a process like this with recommendations and ideas that will help us move the needle. Because if you think about it, if you just want to get to the most fundamental concept of why to do a strategic plan in tourism, it's to try to figure out ways to, if you will, improve, enhance, and look at things that we do, and not necessarily how we can do them better, but maybe even reinforce things that we're doing and saying, let's make that a higher priority, with an ultimate goal of being able to measure that what you've recommended did in fact move the needle. We're big believers in metrics and measurement and trying to figure out how recommendations ultimately translate into either more visitors or visitors during certain periods of time or improved visitor experience or different areas that we might be working through together. And so what the next period of time will be, and you know, we're anxious to walk through a couple of thoughts today. When I say thoughts, things to probe discussion tonight. What the goal is to try to listen carefully to people that are in this community that have, in some cases, been thinking about this issue for a long time. Hopefully bring things that, you know, we've had a chance to experience to the table, combine all that, and, you know, come out with some thoughts that everybody here can support and get behind and try to figure out how to implement. And I want to stress that a little bit, that we're big believers that as part of this process, we want to gain as much buy-in as we can. And so, you know, we'll listen carefully to ideas, and we want you to know that even if coming out of the other end of this, that idea may not surface as a high priority, we want everybody to know that everything that we hear, we really listen to carefully. We try to understand it, and we try to figure it out. And so we try to go back and go, okay, we've heard something, and let's figure out how that might translate. And if in fact it's either not feasible or it's something that can't happen, you're still going to know that you've been part of the process. And you're going to know that we were listening and that we were trying to understand the issue as part of determining what the best outcome will be. So that's really in a nutshell what we're doing. We're going to meet with the internal team and go through a lot of the functional areas when it comes to how we currently execute what we do. And a lot of that is, again, designed to listen and learn and think about where the opportunities are. We've had phone conversations already prior to today with stakeholders, whether it's hospitality stakeholders, whether it's others, and we're doing more of that. We've met with elected officials already, and we're going to meet with more of them. So our goal when this process is done is really that there almost isn't anyone that has wanted to be a part of this that isn't a part of it. And so Bethany and I will make sure that our contact information is available, because one thing we also learn from meetings like this is we'll go through things, you'll hear things, we'll talk about things, we'll get input, and then you'll leave, and tomorrow morning you wake up and go, there's one more thing I forgot to talk about. And we want you guys to have our email addresses, our cell phones, anything you want. And sometimes the best feedback that we get is in those situations where somebody has woken up the next day and said, I got something I want to make sure you guys hear, you guys take a look at. And as you know, in these processes, there's no bad idea. So what we've done here is we've put together a few things, and this is only meant to probe conversation, so this is not a, Bethany will tell you the last thing you want is to hear Dan, drone on for an hour. This is just meant to sort of probe some thinking. And so we've put together a couple of thoughts here about what our process is, and just to look at this, just to start with the boxes that you see here. The group has provided us with a lot of research and a lot of data related to the past. So part of the things that we do when we say project immersion is we try to look at information that demonstrates that we already have, that demonstrates where people are coming from, what's been effective, what hasn't been effective, those kind of things. The good news, and a lot of you know this, is there's a lot of very relevant data that exists. I mean, we go into some strategic planning sessions and there's absolutely none. Here we have a good baseline of things that have been reported on in the past. A lot of you probably have seen these reports. So we really take a look at those. And we try to figure out what we can glean from those. And Bethany and I have already started to review some of that. And what that's designed to do is a couple of things. And one is to try to determine where are our current priorities. So if we were sitting here right now saying, give us the top 10 market segments that we should be going after and why we should be doing that, right? We look at research to help us with that because it tells us, who's coming into Walton County, what's the nature of the visitors, what are the kind of things we've done, and so it gives us a sense of that. Because one of the outcomes of a tourism strategic plan is typically to look at what those priorities are and make sure they are, in fact, for lack of a better term, the right ones. So think about that, because that's an important outcome. And I think that, on behalf of the internal team here, that's going to be important feedback, because we may be working on segments now that make a lot of sense, or we may be working on segments that when everybody thinks about it, they say, maybe we want to redirect some of our, some of who we're targeting. We've gotten feedback about seasonality already. So we've heard people talk about the issue of seasonality in this market, and we want to make sure that we've thought through that question, right? We've worked in other destinations where we walk in and would find out that, let's say it's a very strong summer destination, and we've walked in and found out that they're still putting 80-90% of their resources into the summer. And we sit down and really analyze it. We talk to stakeholders, and they'll say to us, Dan and Bethany, no offense to what's going on, but we really have pretty strong built-in demand for this particular time frame, right? And so what about taking resources and moving them to other time frames and seeing if we can sort of build that business? So we've heard conversations about seasonality, and we're going to dig into that and love to hear feedback on that tonight too. So part of that project immersion, if you will, piece is to really look at past research and to understand, what we've done and who we've been targeting and how that's worked, right? So we'll talk about that. And I would assume, and I'll throw this out, but I think let me ask a question now, and that is, how many of you in this room feel that you're pretty well versed in the research and the reports and that data that has come out of some of the work that's been done in the past? Is how everybody feels? It's great. That's a good start. If you're not, I'll tell you this, tell us that, and we'll make sure you are, because all of it's public, and we would want anyone, because I'll tell you something about that kind of research, is it also helps individual businesses, because that can help an individual business look at what some of the markets are and make determinations themselves. So we always want to make sure that's available in terms of going forward. The next piece is you can see here is stakeholder outreach. So here's another assignment, and that is if you have people or businesses or people in this community that you feel should be part of this process and you want to make sure they are, tell us that. Don't necessarily assume they are. You know, Stan, everybody has given us a whole list of people and we've got processes, but don't assume that we are already set to meet everybody that we should. And if there's somebody you say, you know what, don't forget so-and-so because they bring a certain perspective to this, you know, we want to know that. And so if there's ideas you have on that or thoughts you have there, bring those forward. So again, don't assume that we know everybody, because we don't. And we find that sometimes there are people who other people recommend that really do have interesting insight as part of this process. So please bring those names forward. The next piece that you'll see here is we try to look at, and it's funny, we use this term, you know, you've heard the term best practices. And we always like to, our phrase is we think best practices are a starting point. So we don't necessarily think that the answer is who else is doing it, right? We think the question is what should we aspire to as opposed to what's everybody else doing? I mean, we'll tell you what we've seen, but just because something goes on somewhere else, you know, our goal with our clients is to do things maybe that other people aren't doing, or look at ways to go about our marketing that maybe others aren't trying. You know, I'll give you an example. Even with research, sometimes we try to look at ways to even fine-tune the research more, or try to figure out ways, and we've talked to some of the internal team about this, of, you know, how do you track leisure marketing? So if you think about it, you go out and you raise awareness of Walton County, right? And then you make an assumption because occupancy's up or average daily rate is up or things are up, and so you sort of make an assumption. I'm not saying we're doing this here, by the way, but you make an assumption that it's worked. Right? Sometimes you make an assumption, you say, okay, that means that what we were doing worked. We tend to say, let's dig a little deeper and figure out if there's ways we can really track campaigns or really look at things we're doing and saying, you know, how can we really determine that effort, you know, moved the needle? Because I will tell you that there are times with other clients where if you make the bold statement that occupancy is up and it's because of our work, there are times where stakeholders will listen to that and go, wait a minute, are you telling me that you think that, you know, the work of the tourism organization was the sole reason that, you know, occupancy has increased or ADR has increased? So we want to look at ways to track things that we're doing and even be able to fine-tune that question of ROI. So think about that too and how we can do that. By the way, it's not easy. So this is one of those examples where there aren't a lot of best practices because it's not an easy thing. And if you talk to, you know, other tourism organizations, they're all wrestling with this question. And so we want to work on that here and see if there's opportunities to, you know, to answer that. Let me stop there for a second. When people think about results, so when they've sort of looked at the results so far, does anything I'm saying, do you think to yourself, yeah, it would be interesting to know this? Like, it'd be interesting to understand this better. Anything that kind of comes to your mind where you go, yeah, it'd be great to know that more or understand that better. Anything? Everybody's pretty comfortable with the sort of segments that we're going after and what we're trying to do and at this point? Okay. The next area is, if you've all heard this term, and we, and this is a good one to open it up to everybody, but we try to look very carefully at what people believe are the strengths of Walton County. What are our current weaknesses? You know, what are the opportunities and what are the threats? Right? You know, in some cases, the opportunities and the threats can be the bigger questions. You know, so the opportunities I always look at as what are things that maybe we're not capitalizing on that we could be. You know, things where you say, boy, I think we have an opportunity here that maybe we could be maximizing. Threats are things where you think if we can't figure out a way to fix this, then we do run the risk of negatively impacting tourism in a pretty, you know, significant way. So let me start with the first one, and that is, give me a couple of examples of strengths. A couple of examples of strengths of ourselves as a destination. I mean, I know there's one big one, but somebody say that one big one so we can get the big. There we go. Okay. Sorry? Rain is a good one. But beyond the beach, so let's talk about that. So the beach is obviously magnificent. We were just out there looking at it this morning, fabulous. What's the next one?
Restaurants.
Restaurants, culinary, right?
I think all of our open space.
Open space. What others?
Beyond the beach.
Sorry?
Beyond the beach.
Yep, beyond the beach. So we've established the beach is probably number one. But what are the next ones? What are the ones that, the towns?
Neighborhoods, coastal.
So the unique characteristics, so the fact that we've got towns that have different feel. Okay? You said somewhere here.
Coastal dune lakes.
One more time, I'm sorry.
Coastal dune lakes.
Okay? Coastal Dune, I'm sorry, yeah, read about those. Yeah. Others?
State parks, state forests.
State parks, okay? And all of those that we just mentioned, question, does everybody feel like all those just mentioned are factors, should be, can be, are factors in why visitors come? Or maybe to some extent could be more, could be a bigger factor, but they are assets that we have. Okay? What about weaknesses?
We had a couple more strengths.
Got it?
The fact that we're not South Florida, I think is a strength.
Got it? Okay. Right?
I'm not being facetious there. I think the fact that you can drive here from a lot of destinations is much easier than you can drive in South Florida.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of environment here because of the beach.
Yeah.
But it's the whole atmosphere here. We've spent a lot of time over the past couple of years talking about how do we brand South Walton. And I think everybody recognizes that that is not necessarily something we want to do because we have 16 unique communities here.
Right.
If you try to homogenize it and make it one, then you take away from the uniqueness that we have. It's sort of like Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland's great, but you look at all the little places in Switzerland that have unique characteristics. So I think that's a strength that few other destinations have.
Right.
Again, the proximity to a lot of large population centers that make it easier to drive here is certainly something that we have that if you're going to go to Miami, it's another 12-hour drive.
Right. Well, I'm going to say one thing from an outsider standpoint. So this is going to be a newcomer's comment. I think the climate is unique because we actually do work in some of those other places in Florida, and it is. I mean, it is obviously very different than South Florida, and I mean, I'm sure you guys highlight this, but it's a great attribute.
Tag on to what Art said, from a meeting standpoint, our seasons are flip-flopped, so when you're going to pay big bucks in South Florida, that's the time that we have the least expensive rates, and that's the time we need for kids and beds.
Got it.
It's the shoulder and winter season.
You used to use the word meetings,
Yes.
so you're talking about group travel also.
Corporate incentive association.
Okay, got it. Let's get back to that in a second. I
Let me
wanna-
add to that, while we'd like to have more of that business, we don't have many venues for group meetings.
Okay,
We have 11.
11. Okay,
But they're reasonably small.
Well, our largest is Sandestin, which has 65,000 square feet, and then Hilton has a little over 40,000, so those are our two largest.
got it.
But because they're all different and unique, that makes it very attractive. But yes, if we could have more, that would be great.
Weakness. Let's finish on strengths. Any other strengths?
Just as they were alluding to, some of these things are strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
The diversity of this product, 90% of it being non-typical, so it's very much a home away from home. But then that also provides challenges to not being as easy for new consumers to
Understand
what is here. So some things are both or many.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on the strength side? Let's move to weaknesses. What do we see as weaknesses? Infrastructure. Okay. Okay. So in infrastructure, obviously what we're talking about in a way is visitor experience. So visitor experience gets impacted because of our infrastructure,
And the residents too.
right? Local but I mean, just for a moment on the visitor side, we think it's, okay. What other weaknesses?
Those are the top three. Infrastructure is 1, 2, and 3.
Okay. Okay.
Primarily, when you say parking and traffic,
Yeah.
or the specifics, beach access,
Sorry?
public beach access.
Beach access. Okay.
Labor force,
Labor force.
strength of labor force in the field.
Okay.
Sometimes this can be a strength and a weakness. So
Okay.
we are with 16 neighborhoods, and when there's a hurricane, we're glad we don't mention South Boston, they say Destin, but they're geographically, we're challenged when we go out of the market and try to tell people where we are.
Got it.
People want to call us Destin, and we're not.
Okay.
On the beach access, it's a very complicated issue, but we have limited public beach. A lot of the beach is private, and that's a very contentious issue these days.
Okay.
As to whether or not the public can use or cross over, they can certainly cross over by customary use, but to actually set up their rental chairs and so forth on private beaches is a very sore point these days. So there is a limited amount of public beach available for the
Got it.
number of visitors we have.
Got it. Other weaknesses.
I think we have to utilize our parks.
Okay.
We have beautiful parks.
Okay.
And you brought up earlier, being a highly seasonal product is a disadvantage to your business plan. It also is an opportunity.
Right. Okay.
Lack of a well-defined market.
Okay. So this issue of how we, which is a tough question, right? How we define ourselves, how we, what we, if somebody walked up to us and said, give us the elevator pitch, that's a tough one?
No, not for me, but for some people it might be.
Okay.
I do it all the time. I'm the director of sales, so I do it all the time.
She spends a lot of time in elevators.
That's right, that's right.
But if you mention a few of the beach communities when you're talking to somebody out of the market, you can't just say, hey, I'm from South Boston, because then they glaze over. But if you say, you're probably familiar with Seaside, Sandestin, or Creighton Beach, then you see the light bulb go off.
Okay.
Unfortunately, a lot of people condense it and say, well, it's Destin, well, it's not
Yeah.
Destin.
Got it.
Too many, even the feds actually like to use Destin in their advertising.
But let me ask a question. So let's assume we had a brand. Let's just assume for argument's sake, magically there's this brand sitting there. And we had to write the brand promise. What would we write? So back to this point, I think at the point you were driving at is if we're trying to say to somebody, here's our brand, but whatever that brand says, might not even say Walton County, but whatever we use is this symbol. And below it somebody says, tell us what that means. So tell us what the symbol means. Right, that's where you got to say, that's the elevator pitch. That this is somebody that has no idea. They're just trying to get a sense of what we are. What is it going to say?
I think it's an amalgamation of the strengths, the beautiful beaches, the 16 beach neighborhoods that have their own identity, but make up a greater being that's different than any other economy, and then, a richness of cultural and lifestyle experiences beyond the beach.
Okay. Okay. Other thoughts on that? Other thoughts that would differentiate? And those are great. Anything else where you would say there's something we could say where someone would go, that's us. And it's not necessarily that this is a tough question. We don't have to necessarily answer this today, but something where we could say something when someone would go, yeah, that's us, and that's not anybody else.
South Boston has something for everyone, depending on what you're looking for. You can have a different experience in each community or neighborhood rather, and you can come back 16 times and have 16 different experiences.
Okay. A lot of opportunity. Any other thoughts?
I don't know how you categorize this, but I think one of the strengths might be we don't have a whole bunch of big chain hotels.
Okay.
So it's not like going to Honolulu or any other large resort community and saying, well, there's a Sheraton, there's a Hilton, there's a Hyatt. No, they're all lined up, and we don't have that. And I think that adds to the character of what we have.
Yeah.
We keep saying it's different neighborhoods, different, Seaside is one place, Rosemary Beach is another place, and they all have their own characteristics.
Because obviously local ownership or local business, you can, in a way, you can only find those businesses here. That's the whole point, is they're unique because they're, okay.
You've got 5 state parks with a very small land mass.
Okay. Okay, what about opportunities? What about things where,
Let me say one more thing. I think the thing that stands out to me, not being a native from here, but traveling around here, there's no competition for us in this area. I mean, what we have, our neighbors don't have, quite frankly.
What?
They just don't.
Well, how do we say that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, but that's the difference. That's what makes this place what it is. You can't go anywhere within probably a 200-300 mile radius here and have as many opportunities, have the types of beaches, have the ecotourism, have the agritourism. I mean, it's different than anywhere I've ever been.
Mhm.
West Coast, East Coast, I mean, anywhere I've ever been. And I think, I don't know the words right now, I could probably come up with 10, given like a few hours, but, I mean, that's what it is. This place is just different.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way around it, whether it's not having the hotels, having the communities, it's just different.
Okay.
It's scenic, we have a scenic roadways and it's scenic, the beauty here is very different, it's very scenic. I think that's something that
Yeah.
is very.
And let me just stay with this. Let me go off topic a second. So based on everything we just said, really cool thoughts here, based on everything we just said, this is going to be a tough question. Who's the primary, and I know times of year are going to affect your answer here, but based on everything you just said, who's the primary target from a visitor perspective? I know there's more than one, but I mean, if you...
Let me go back, though, before we get into that.
Okay.
And I'm trying to synthesize what I've heard here.
Okay.
The product is unique, not within 200 or 300 miles. The product's unique, period.
Right.
If you think about Amelia Island, and they have Banks, Naples, Key West, there is no other product like this where you have new urbanism and seaside and with the beach, and then you have Great Beach, which is very much old Florida. You have very distinct communities.
Mm-hmm.
And when people come down here, then they try 4 or 5 of them based on research. But they settle on one. I'm a Rosemary Beach guy, or I'm a seaside guy.
Right.
And the brand loyalty is incredible.
Yeah.
The percentages who come back. Now, having said that, the product is unique, but the brand awareness is limited.
Yeah.
As South Florida, not as Seaside, not as Rosemary Beach, but as South Florida. With this wonderful product that isn't being translated into a brand.
Right. And that's sort of the $1 million question is how do we do that? How could we do that? We don't have to necessarily answer that exactly tonight, but how might we do that? So that that person could in a fairly quick, somehow they could in a fairly quick way get that, what you just said, someone could look at something or read something or hear something and I kind of get that. I don't have an answer. I'm just curious to, how, because I think that's an interesting sort of outcome of this, is what that might be.
In a way, I think if you're trying to get a sports fan interested in something, you sell baseball, but you also focus on a particular team that that person might be interested in.
Right.
So you're not just selling the Cincinnati Reds or the New York Yankees. You're selling the idea, hey, baseball's a great sport. By the way, pick your own team.
Right.
And if you want a West Coast team or East Coast team, that's all yours. I think, so, yes, we want a brand, but we also don't want to homogenize the whole thing so that there isn't any uniqueness to the communities we have. You need to keep those communities because we keep saying it's unique. Well, why would you want to do away with something that's unique? We want to keep the uniqueness, but we also want to capture it in a phrase. Like if you say Napa Valley, people go, oh, I know what Napa Valley is. Well, no, you don't really. What you know is you have a particular winery that you love to go to, or there's a certain kind of product that you like within that. But they have the advantage of being able to encapsulate it in 2 words.
Right.
And Hilton Head, in a certain sense, has that too. And I don't think it's as important that we come up with the 1 or 2 words that just says it all. As long as we keep the idea out there that what we have here from county line to county line is a really different, as Phil says, there's nowhere that quite compares to what we have right now.
Right, and then keep thinking, even within what you just said, keep thinking about, how do we maximize that, or how do we take that? And like, I understand that brand was maybe the wrong way to approach it, but just how do you tell that story in some fashion? What about opportunities? What about things where we say to ourselves, boy, if we kind of took advantage of this more, or if we capitalized on this more, this would help us.
I look at the area as a unique series of coastal villages, and we have incredible resources in between.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
the sort of infrastructure / visitor experience kind of piece.
Villages and unique towns and so on.
Okay.
Via sidewalk, streetscapes, appropriate bike paths, and, something a little bit nicer. I think Fairfield in general is not that great. The road itself, the links between, the villages and the natural resources we have are unquestionably, world class. But the connections between them are pretty bad.
So connectivity, if you will, that's a big opportunity. And we think that if we had a better way, even if, some of it's big stuff, which is roads and things, but there may be other ideas here. But if we had a better way to connect, if we had a better way for that visitor to make that connection easily, that would be an opportunity that we would gain from. That's your thought, right? That's what you're sort of saying. We miss that. There's a piece there that a person can't experience as much as they.
We want to make this experience better. I find it's getting worse due to the infrastructure issues, but and that's for guests and residents, which I'm
Right.
a resident of Seawood Beach, so I see it improved in a nice way to embellish what we have.
Right.
As opposed to
I'm sorry. Yeah.
To build on what Richard was saying, so many of the things that attract people here are visual. Whether it's the architecture, whether it's the natural beauty of the parks, the beaches, and what Richard was talking about, making that experience, bringing our infrastructure and our roadways and our bridges. We've got these 15 coastal dune lakes that a lot of them have bridges. We've got standard issue, Jersey barrier, sides on the bridges where we've got this beautiful place. That's what we advertise. But when we get down to the infrastructure level, it's standard issue, no imagination, and it doesn't fit. Excuse me, you're right. It doesn't fit with everything that we're trying to sell.
Got it. Anything you think about beyond sort of the, we've been seeing some go on with widening of roads and different things happening, but beyond that kind of thing, anything you think about where you think, maybe there's some short-term other ways to go at this, other ways to try to, help this, or other thoughts, for example, again, are there ways that we could create that visitor experience or get visitors from one place to another, or do things where, at least on the visitor experience side, we could make an impact there? This is before the idea of, big infrastructure.
This isn't exactly an answer to your question, but there are bid tax collectors that I don't think would be very enthusiastic about connectivity in the sense that you used it.
Yep.
In other words, if somebody comes to Sandestin, there's a lot to do within Sandestin, there's a lot to do within a mile or so of Sandestin in terms of Grand Boulevard and shopping and so forth. But I don't think, as a rule, the people in Sandestin want to encourage people to go to Rosemary Beach or somewhere else. Not that they keep them from going, but they want to keep them captive. And same for Seaside, same for Rosemary Beach. So while it may appear to be, gee, we've got all these things, why don't you see them all? It's like Disney World. I think that the people that are collecting the bed tax would just as soon keep them in their backyard, and the restaurateurs in that area would like to keep them in their backyard and go to the other end of the county.
Okay.
So connectivity can be viewed positively and negatively.
Okay.
One of the things that we call it scenic 30A, and 30A is extremely well known. Lots of websites and different things around here that refer to it. It's not very scenic. A few years back, I know there was a real push to see if we couldn't get things like garbage can containers. I mean, that's a simple thing, but it's not attractive. And I mean, you run up and down 30A right now, after a few days of wind, there's garbage can lids all over the place, garbage cans thrown out. There's no continuity of designs, and I know there's a charrette, that's being in the works and all, and then I think things like that will help. Streetscapes are a really great way to create that connectivity you're talking about without necessarily transferring Rosemary Beach people to Sandestin, to Graton Beach, or different places, but to create a connectivity of how the communities all look neat and tidy
Mm-hmm.
and somewhat connected without being identical. If
Got
that makes sense.
Sure.
And I think those are things that would make a big impact on visitors. And I know there's lots of people that have thought about that. I've heard many meetings where that kind of thing got discussed. But the garbage cans alone would be a humongous improvement.
Okay, so I mean, because sometimes those, I mean, you think of something, you think about Michigan Avenue in Chicago, right? I mean, it sounds like what Daley did there was put flowers. I mean, it wasn't, if you think about what he did with Michigan Avenue, really, it was putting flowers out there, and a lot of people think that completely transformed that experience. It wasn't necessarily so. Okay, other thoughts?
Well, that's
Jim?
one of the opportunities is the design shred.
Yeah.
It's designed to follow this for a purpose,
Yeah.
so that we can connect, because the communities themselves, Seaside, look like Seaside, Rosemary, will look like Rosemary. It's the space in between that, for lack of a better term, looks like, the redneck Riviera.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whether it's not scenic, and, we've got 1 million parking signs, well, 500 or 700, no parking signs, I'm sorry, no parking signs. Half of, and we've got probably 10 different variations of no parking signs, so it is that calming effects, the developers of the communities get, that you want a uniform look, but it doesn't have to be an exact replication,
Uh-huh.
but you want kind of a feel, and we don't have that outside those 16 communities.
Got it. What other opportunities, things that you think to yourself, well, if we did something here, we could maximize this. It already exists. We could leverage it further. We could get more out of it.
Our parks.
Parks.
We have gorgeous, gorgeous parks, and we just aren't optimizing them. I'm not saying nobody's trying, it's just, we haven't figured out how to really do it.
Okay.
I think something that could be improved on to in that quarter is possibly some transit out there, or trolley, and not just, I'm talking, St. Charles Street, New Orleans trolley, for visitors to connect with these things, and make it more walkable in addition to that, so,
Okay.
do things like that, I think that would kind of make these series of villages together, in a romantic way and a useful way.
Okay. Other thoughts? What about threats? What about things where you say to yourself, if we don't figure this one out, and I think we've heard some of them already, but if we really don't figure this out, this could be a really negative impact. I mean, I'm sure infrastructure's in there, but we can
Privatizing the beach,
privatize the beach.
I think that's the big threat.
So explain that a little more.
I guess, individually owning the beach, individual lot, seems like that's on the horizon.
Meaning like with concessions, when you say privatize, you mean actually ownership of the land? I mean,
Ownership of the land, keeping the public home.
What I'm talking about is actually private property owners exercising their private property rights.
okay.
A lot of our single-family dwellings go down to the main high water line, in resort communities as well. And as more people have found us or coming here, congestion on the beach causes more people to try to make themselves exclusive and keep other people off their property.
Got it.
It's not a new privatization, it's just an exercise of my private property rights. Where we didn't have it before. 10 years ago, beaches and congestion, it's there right now, it wasn't such an issue.
Hmm.
So, that and the beaches are getting much narrower, so another threat is, of course, lack of beach management, in the form of, beach nourishment or alternate plans in case of a, catastrophic storm.
Mother Nature in this business is always near the top of the threat list.
Mm-hmm.
Contingency planning.
Okay.
Keep in mind too, that not all these properties go down to the beach. It's a very mixed, bag of property lines along that beach area for these 23 miles we have.
Mm-hmm.
So some of them will go to the dune, bottom of the dune, some of them will go down to the high line. So, there's some other issues there that we have. Some areas are open, some areas are privately owned.
So let me ask you a question. I mean, for example, I'm just thinking about a way to, if we were to look at the whole 20 some odd miles, there would be a way to take a map and go, worst case scenario. So if you were to visualize this, and you said everybody that thought they had the right for a moment, whether they do or not is another issue, but let's just say that they thought they had a right, if they exercised it. And so you would start sort of, blocking out beach that would become private. What percent, we can do this, we'll do this, but what percent of the beach would end up, if you had to guess at this, would end up being private? What I'm driving at is, if you actually said, okay, those are now sort of, for lack of a better term, off limits, is it 30%, is it 20%, is it 50%, what's everybody's sense of that?
I'd say excluding the state-owned lands as the state parks, I'd say it's about 70% of private property, or probably goes down to water.
So in its worst case scenario, just the absolute worst outcome, if you will, it could be as high as 70%.
Two-thirds of it's private.
But you have
Six miles is state parks and state beaches, and you have almost 2 miles of public beaches, county beaches, or public access ways, and so the other 18 miles or whatever it is, 17 miles is private. Most of it. I mean, some of it does not go all the way down, but most of it does.
The problem becomes, the sheriff cannot enforce a lot of this rule, because unless you have the documents in your hand saying, well, I actually own right up to this here. And so the sheriff's people often have to deal with disputes about whether people are on private property or public property, and homeowners say it's mine, and private resident or visitors say, well, I have the right to be here. So it gets a very, very contentious issue.
Mm-hmm.
And, people that own the property obviously don't want to have people camping in front of their houses, or in some cases they complain that people will actually come up and use their porches. So it's a very contentious issue, like I say. But I would agree with Brian, it's probably in the 60 to 70% range.
And, to Brian's point about the amount of people on the beach, that is certainly part of it. But I've observed over the last probably 7, 8 years that, it used to be that people went to the beach for 2 or 3 hours and then they left. And now they go to the beach, they set up tents, they bring coolers, and I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with all those, but it's almost like an entire camping setup, and it will be from sun up to sundown. And because there's a lot of this area that is privately owned, it means there's no bathrooms, and so that presents its own situations. And, people are literally staying down there all day. They're vacating the area when they want to do things, but leaving all their setups and things. So I think it's partly people, but it's partly what people are doing now that 5, 6, 7 years ago, I hardly ever saw a tent out on the beach. Now you can't, that's one of Brian's maintenance guy's favorite things is picking up tents, that have been left behind on the beach. What's that?
I got that. I got it.
That was sarcasm.
I got it.
But it's a different, I think it's a different attitude that the beachgoers have today than what they had before, in addition to just the sheer numbers.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody's sitting out there in little fold-up beach chairs and they got a little bitty cooler and they stay for 3 or 4 hours, people don't really pay much attention to that. But when they set up wall-to-wall all these different tents and stay there literally from sun up to sundown, it definitely impacts how people feel.
Got it.
I think the public-private beach issue is a huge issue in this county, and there have been a couple incidents between tourists and residents about that. There have also been some murky deed transfers, making what was once public private. So as we go forward as a community and this issue heats up, can see it as a real liability for our community.
Yeah.
The openness that our community has been known for.
Yeah. Let me just say one thing about a process like this. I mean, one of the goals that we as a firm try to do in processes like this is figure out, you know, that's an area where we try to figure out how can, you know, an opportunity of what comes out of this impact it. I mean, so you're almost strategizing ahead of time. That's why I was asking about this idea of, you know, are there ways to try to paint this picture that are going to have the most impact? You know, if in fact this is really, you know, we all kind of look at this and say this is a big issue. Because sometimes I'll say to people, we want to make sure we use the process so it can be the most effective it can be, right? And so keep that in the back of your minds. We want to, if as we get through this, we realize, yes, this is a very high priority, then the question becomes, how do we do something how does something coming out of this, you know, create the best platform for something to actually happen? Because it's easy for us to go, okay, well then we're going to write these as one of the, you know, sort of one of the weaknesses, and everybody goes, okay, we knew that. But is there an approach that would come out of this, or as part of, you know, if we were now here standing in front of you presenting, would there be a way that everybody would say there's a way to do this where this will have the most impact? I don't know what that is yet, but think about that, because that's one of the things we try to think about is, you know, it's kind of like we use the term, you know, how do we use the process to try to make the most impact on an issue? And so just food for thought when you think about that.
Surprised no one has mentioned this yet, but I think the biggest threat that we have right now is a combination of things: overdevelopment along 38, losing the whatever word you want to use, the character that is present there, and turning it into more of a commercial, typical beachfront, and stormwater retention. Those things I think are all together. If you're overbuilding, you've got stormwater problems. We don't have proper stormwater retention right now or drainage, and a lot has to be put into that. But if we had a very difficult issue here a couple of months ago where Hampton Inn tried to come in and build property, and the community rose up in arms, and a lot of people were pushing for it and trying to put a different kind of a property on 38 because Hampton Inn is a Hampton Inn. I mean, it's a big volume,
right.
low rent kind of a low daily rate kind of a place. It just didn't fit the character of the community. And I see that as being an ongoing threat. I mean, the Hampton Inn was defeated, but there'll be another Hampton Inn coming along pretty soon. People will find a piece of property and they say, ooh, you know, I can build up, I can build out. Parking then becomes an issue where you're trying to cram too many cars into a small space. So all of that, stormwater retention, affects the character of the neighborhood, and overdevelopment kills the golden goose.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest threats is confusing the destination with the organization. We're doing a strategic plan for Visit South Walton.
Right.
We're doing a strategic plan for South Walton because a lot of folks in this community want to make the organization the solution to all their problems. And the solution to all their problems are the county commissioners in Phoenix Springs, or down here, when they meet down here, not this organization. This organization has a specific role. It's not the transportation, it's not the infrastructure, it's not the water management district, it's none of those. Can it help or can it participate? You know, that's up to the county commissioners. But it has a very well-defined statutory role. And one of the threats to the organization is that you go beyond that. Because the bed tax collector, you know, we've gone in this continuum from a heads and beds 30 years ago or whatever to a destination management organization. But if you go much further, the bed tax collectors will say, no, that's our money, okay? And it's designed by statute to use for marketing, not to use for the 4,800 other things that you guys have siphoned off money for. So I think that's a threat to the organization.
Gotcha. Okay.
I just wanted to add, I think one of the threats is if we don't work together collaboratively, organizations, citizens, they speak up, good local government to make sure it remains a unique and livable and sustainable place to live.
Okay.
So I think that's very, I
So let me just stay with that for a second. So I think part of what you're saying, we actually talked about this as part of kind of putting this together, was how do we create the connectivity so that, for lack of a better term, the citizen sees the value, if you will, but at the same time there's, you know, all these, if you will, things are considered as part of how decisions are made. And it doesn't mean that it's, you know, always everybody agrees with everything, but how do you create that? Yeah, we talked about this question of, you know, it's an interesting challenge of how do you, and this is probably the wrong word, but how do you educate the citizens on kind of the value, right? So, you know, what's the importance of tourism? You know, how do you do that? Because the problem is if it's just a bunch of big numbers and these sort of things, you lose them sometimes. But how do you do it in a way that you can start to create that connection with, you know, how does everybody benefit from this to some degree, which they do? You know, somebody earlier mentioned jobs and mentioned labor force and that whole piece, and, you know, that's obviously a huge part of this. It's you know, arguably the major industry. Well, that means a lot of people are working, which is a wonderful thing. So, you know, how do you talk about all those benefits in a way that creates that connection that you're talking about? It's not easy to do, by the way, because it's just, you know,
I think it is imperative that organizations work together.
Right.
We work together with TDPC, we work with others, and we come up with solutions and talk about this. This is an ongoing conversation. To help the community keep it.
Just to stay with what, you know, when everybody hears that comment, and this is meant to be constructive, my question, but when you hear that comment, what are things that you think are kind of barriers to that? What are things that you think, you know, this is something that I think either holds that back, and this is not meant to be subjective, but what kind of objective things where you think, you know, this might help that, what you just raised? What are your thoughts?
There's no vehicle for that to happen.
Vehicle? Okay. Talk about that. I mean, there's no platform.
No, I mean, we've got the TBC meetings that we can go to, but I think just in general, public comment and, you know, I've been here for a while, and when we used to have workshops, we would sit around the table and just talk and share ideas and brainstorm.
Right.
And now it seems like everything, we go to a county commission meeting, we're limited to 3 minutes. You know, it's very formal, it seems very rigid. And I agree with you that it would be a great idea for these organizations to work together because there is incredible talent in this and passion in this community. But I don't really see any vehicle for that to actually happen. Like a summit or something like that where there would be an agenda.
Yeah.
You would have South Florida Community Council, the TBC, representative from the community and the other groups, and the Walpack taxpayers, that South Walton, a bunch of these groups sitting down and talking about these problems, but there just isn't a vehicle to make that happen.
Okay.
Unless we as citizens do that ourselves.
Right. Okay, so one recommendation there is creating some type of a platform, some way that could happen. It doesn't have to be monthly, could be twice a year, it could be quarterly, it could be, but something where that would be one way you think might move that forward. Other thoughts just on that question?
Well, I think that one of the challenges, it sort of ties into that, but we have such a large second homeowner population here, so awareness is even more of a challenge than it is in any city or town or county. That's always a challenge to keep the citizenry aware of things that are going on, unless it's like a really big, obvious issue like an Hampton Inn coming in on a little, you know, it's like a beach road. But there's so much other that people just aren't aware of. So when we have this element of so many second homeowners who don't live here full time, then it becomes even more challenging. So a way to tap into those people would be helpful in something like that, because they are invested and they do care. But, well, some of them don't. The apathy is one of your big challenges of that. When we first asked the question, that's the first thing that came to my mind. But for those who do care, it's the challenge of how do you keep people aware?
Right.
Even those sessions you just talked about, a couple a year, like they'll go by and a bunch of people won't even know they ever happened.
So just one quick thought on that, what you just said. Let's use the Hampton Inn example. So your point is, if there was one of these platforms where managed growth, I'll just use that term, was kind of one of the topics, Archie, to your point about how do you, that's a preemptive kind of conversation to a Hampton Inn is, how do we talk about managed growth and how do we talk about how it fits and all these sort of questions. Your point would be, if that's not really well thought through, you may not get the turnout to really discuss the issue of what might, and I'm not anything against Hampton Inns, by the way, but would prevent the next one, and we wait to react to whatever the next issue is as opposed to trying to figure out maybe a way that sort of answers that question or talks about that question ahead of time. Okay?
I think one of the biggest challenges is there's too many different groups that want different things.
Right.
There's some people that might want to Hampton Inn.
Right.
There's 5 groups or 6 groups that don't want it. And there's some people that want parking areas and very limited because of property, max value of property, best use of property. Of course, it's surface parking.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just not much that many areas left. So people want parking, but they don't know where to put it, or they don't want to give up any land that could be available to put it.
Right.
I'm saying is you've got so many different groups that want different things on their 38.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it a big problem of trying to get everybody together to come to a collective agreement of how we move
Right.
forward.
But I do think that, just to stay with us for 1 second, I do think that if they're done, and again, that you can't make them too frequent, but if you can get the dialogue going, even if somebody doesn't get what they want, they feel better that they were in the dialogue than if they were not in it at all. And so how do you at least give people that sense, right?
To Lee's point, though, about apathy, because you have all these different communities, I think with them other than Sandestin, the people in Sandestin could give a rat's whisker about what was happening on Hampton, because it's not there, it's not in their backyard.
Right.
It's a different world. Now, we have an issue where the owner of Sandestin is trying to get a permit to build a 24-story building. All of a sudden, the people in Sandestin are all up in arms. Well, people in 38 are probably saying, no, it's not my problem, it's not my house, it's from yours. So, and I don't mean that in a selfish way, but you tend to look at what's in your backyard or down the street from you, as opposed to what's 5 miles away.
Right.
Okay, so it's a little bit tangled, but just bear with me. What you've gotten to now is really the most frequent struggle in this community is this disconnect. And to reiterate Jim's point, we can make this better with strategic plans for the organization that clarifies, but we can also make it worse when we've got situations that people think that the Hampton Inn is somehow the responsibility of the TDC.
Right.
It is not. Is it important to this community? Yes, it is. But we have a tendency to muddle all of this stuff. And, people think code enforcement on the beach sets the laws. They do not. They only enforce what they've been charged to do.
Mm-hmm.
So every conversation we have, there's a high percentage of disconnect for actually who we're speaking to, what their purvey is, what their potential impact is. And we spend so much time and energy with misplaced effort there, concern, engagement, community interest, that's where you get this fatigue factor and this apathy issue. I went to the TDC and they did nothing about the vendor law or the Hampton Inn. You're right. They didn't, because it's not the TDC's responsibility. So I think we need to do a really good job of recognizing that there may be 100 things, but maybe there's only 20 of them that rest here. The others, can we be supportive? Can we be involved? Can we get out of the way? I think that's going to be the hardest part of all this, because we could give you a list, we could give you a list of 100 valid issues in this community. But if they're not placed with the responsible party, we make it worse by misleading folks thinking that they're going to get action, they're going to get participation. I'll use one little example and then I'll give it back to you. We talk about the beach ownership. Everything everybody said in here is representative of the issue and the threat that exists with the beach domain. The flip side is 100% of the water's edge and that supportive beach will always be public. So when we talk, we have to be careful not to make things worse. Is it a serious threat that all that private land might not be used? Yes. Do we need to be cautious that we maintain perspective and have an objective addressment of that issue, and that nobody owns the water's edge, nobody owns the sand that is the coastline? It's just a little semantics detail.
Sure.
But that's where we spend so much time going in circles. We're gonna lose all of our beach, we won't even be able to get to the water. Not true.
Right.
So just that tangle is really what I've seen for 11 years, is that we spend most of our energy struggling instead of going in a direction.
The only thing, here's the only challenge is, and I know this is going to be a broad statement, but anything that ultimately is going to affect the tourism product, right, to some degree, and again, it may not be a direct TDC, like directly has the authority to do something, but the advocacy piece or the, how you advocate or how that piece happens can be critical, because sometimes there are other members of the community that don't necessarily see it through the visitor lens always, or don't realize that could really have an impact that then it does impact jobs, it impacts tax revenues and all sort of thing. So it's that issue of, I understand, it's the issue of advocacy, if you will, versus thinking that it's somehow going to be fixed, by one organization.
Beach domain is one of the most serious threats to the organization of the Walton County Tourist Development Council.
Right.
However, it may not be sole responsibility.
Right.
And all may not be lost when we identify what the threat is. And so all of that, if that's not clear, then that's that disconnect where everybody's like, I heard that, all the beaches, potentially, 70% of the beach could potentially go private. Not exactly, but a serious threat. So that's a hard thing if you don't live this every day and keep that 360 view, and so the strategic plan has a chance to do.
Yeah, and I think your point is what's the best way to, again, I'm using advocacy or collaborate, or what's the best way to try to be a part of that?
Yes.
And not necessarily soon. Okay, great.
Well, there's, to tie the 3 points together, there's the balkanization of this destination, and there always has been, but the pressure to unify it or homogenize it under the South Walton brand is more critical now than ever, because Art's right. The people in Sandestin don't give a rap about 38. They'll go down there and have a dinner, and everybody on 38 thinks the sun rises and sets on 38. It does not. It rises and sets on the rest of the county just as well as it does on 38. Now, I've spent years down there managing one community. And within those communities down there, there's a balkanization. Hey, I'm a Rosemary Beach person, or I'm a Seaside person, or I'm a Watercolor person. There's a balkanization. And there's got to be a way so that we show everybody it's in their best interest to care about South Walton. And the bed tax collectors, they're getting, Sandestin and Elton, they've started putting Visit South Walton on their websites and on their ads and things like that. And the ones down on 38 have started doing it. But it's a
Gotcha.
It's a slow process.
Yep.
I'm not saying this is disagree, because I do agree with that, but what you just said about people starting to visit South Walton that haven't before, I think there is a change in that direction. I'm so sorry to be, of course, but going back to Hampton Inn, what I saw was there were people from all throughout South Walton showing up to those meetings. There were people from Rosemary Beach, Alice Beach, Inlet Beach, Boone, Allen, Water Sound, all over the place, because they got that what happens down the street from them will eventually impact them if it goes to enough of a point. And I think that's how you can communicate and educate to hopefully get more people out of that myopic, it only matters if it's in my backyard. Because I'll tell you one thing, everybody cares about it. Everybody is property rights.
Yes.
And so when you get, and the thing that I think has maybe made us a little myopic is that we really haven't historically, and we're a pretty young place, a destination, but we haven't had much threat to that.
And now all of a sudden, because we've been very fortunate, we've had very responsible development happen for the most part. The aesthetics are amazing, the architecture is amazing from the development that's happened. And now we're starting to see the chinks in the armor of that. And I think when we see that, people do start taking notice. People don't like that convenience store with all the junk out front, the doggy signs and the red, yellow, and blue, and green colors, if you know who I'm talking about. Whether they live right next to it or not, they're like, ugh, that's not what I want in my community. And so I think that's one of the reasons we haven't seen much, because we haven't had many of those threats. And now they're starting to happen, and people are like, wow.
Well, let me agree and disagree. I agree property values are the number one, okay? And that's from the rental perspective, okay? People want us to continue to bring that high-end renter down. I disagree because and Lee made my point, every community that you mentioned is a 38 community, okay? And when we were at last week, when we went to the South Walton event at Bud and Alley's, I said, count how many people are here from Sandestin or Miramar Beach. You know, Art was there, there were about 5. Okay, and so the thing that we've got to do is figure out as a community how to bring those two disparate things together. Because if you don't, you'll never get the energy that you need.
Well, the truth is we're almost 3, because north of the bay, West County, East County, 38, it is very, very much so.
Well, it sounds like on top of the specific issues, just to sort of wrap this piece, it sounds like that there's this opportunity to try to create, and again, I'm not saying it, and back to everybody's point, doesn't mean that it sits solely with the TDC, but to try to create some type of a communication / platform / approach to this that tries to create some platform to try to see if this dialogue could be stimulated, right? And you got to have, I mean, back to your point about partners there in the back, you know, it's almost got to be that it comes from all the partners. It's not coming from one organization, but all the partners say, here's what we're going to do, and try to create some approach to that to see if that can start that dialogue. Yeah.
There is a big difference, though, between west of Topsail, let's call it, and here. I mean, they have highlights. You know, it's a whole different environment than the 38 section of Walton County. Now, how that materialized, I don't know all the history on that or anything, but I mean, for instance, you know, the Edgewaters and the really big buildings, they don't exist on this side. And the same thing, it's kind of like when you get on the north side of the bay, you're so geographically separated. And I guess in a way, Topsail is the geographic separation between 38 and, let's say, Miramar Beach area. But that's a dynamic. I mean, that particular dynamic, I don't know that you're going to change because it is a geographic separation, and Miramar Beach evidently has very different rules than what they have for parts of Walton County. I mean, how did they get high rises? I thought it was like a 5-story limit. Did anybody? 50 feet or whatever it is.
It just happened to develop earlier.
Oh, so they got it, and then they made the rule that's 50 feet.
Well, and I say that because really this comes down to money, okay? And what people don't realize is, particularly the folks on 38, 40% of the revenue generated for the TDC is generated in Sandestin and Miramar Beach. Okay, 40%.
Right.
40% is along 38, and 20% for those management companies that go county by county.
Okay, final comment on this, and we'll move on.
I want to say something about what John was talking about before. People confusing issues and who's responsible. That's a huge problem. And I think education just in general, in placing those, identifying who's responsible for what, I think would be a great thing. I think if the TDC, you know, perhaps clear that when those confusions happen in the newsletter that goes out, on the Facebook page, if you guys try to put that out in a blast that cleared up those misconceptions and confusions. With social media being what it is today, I think that would go a long way to clearing up that
Okay.
the perception problem that he's had. One other thing I just want to say about property values, I was on a conference call recently, and we were told that South Walton is the envy of the state in property values and revenue. What we're talking about here in South Walton, it is so important to maintain the environment and the uniqueness of our community so that that can happen.
Right.
That's all.
Let me just talk about two other quick subjects. These are more specifically related to kind of strategic planning process, right? Just real quick. And one of them is this issue of market segmentation. So we've looked at some of the past research. We're going to have internal conversations with the team about this. And part of the outcome of this is to try to, and it may just reinforce, but to sort of talk through, again, I should have talked about this earlier, what are our priorities? Who are the priority markets? So if we're saying, these are sort of target markets, both geographical and actually demographics of who they are, and for what times of year. So it may be different. People talked about seasonality. The type of target that we may be targeting for purposes of off-season may be, in fact, it usually is, very different than it is sort of peak season. And we're going to work through with the internal team plus with past research and sort of talk through that. And so that's an important piece because sometimes people, and I've already heard this in conversations, sometimes people can perceive the whole market segmentation issue as if we're almost favoring a particular market. And this really has to do with what market is the best match for us purely from a standpoint of who can we attract. And that's the issue. It's really there are markets out there that we could say we'd really like to have more of that market, and it just may not be a match for us. And that's what this process is about, is trying to sort of work through that and then have everybody here understand that from a marketing perspective, here are the target markets that we're going after. So when someone comes and says, I really think you should be going after kids that are between 0 and 2 and whatever it may be, we can say, we've kind of studied that, right, and we just don't think we have a good product for them right now, or whatever it may be. And so that's part of just so everybody knows kind of what that piece is. And then I don't know if there necessarily needs to be discussion because when we come out of that, I think it's going to be something that everybody will be interested in looking at, and then we can share it in a way that also helps educate people on that whole question. Because we find sometimes that people will say, well, why aren't you going after this? Like, why aren't you doing this? And this is designed to try to have an outcome that sort of clarifies that.
I think it's only fair to compliment Jim and John and the rest of the team for having done that very well over the last couple of years. Really focused in on where the right people are they the right match for us, and focusing the advertising to those particular markets, as opposed to just advertising all over the East
Right.
Coast.
Which is perfect.
And some of the markets they've identified where and Pam has been very much involved in this, where they've gone in 100% of those markets and just blitzed it, set up things at the airport to say, hey, come on down, tell people about South Walton. They've done a terrific job of doing it.
Perfect. Next one that was mentioned earlier was group sales. So we're going to talk about this whole question of, beyond just individual travel, right? What's the current plan? What are thoughts? How could that evolve in the future? So what's the opportunity there? By the way, this isn't just traditional. Some people think of it just being meetings. It may not be just meetings. It may be other types of groups. Opportunities, again, back to shoulder periods. There may be opportunities to specifically target specific type of group travel. And then again, what is the infrastructure? What are the needs to service those groups? That's sort of part of what that piece is. And the last thing I want to talk about is measurement. And we talked about this earlier. One of the things we really want to try to focus on, and this is, again, I want to say this is not easy, but we want to try to really focus on determining which metrics, and there's a lot of them now, but which metrics do we think are the most important? So if someone said to us, you got 2 minutes to tell us how we're doing, right? What is that metric going to be, right? And you've also got another minute to tell us how the things that we've done were able to drive return. What's that? And that's not easy, but we're going to try to talk through what those opportunities might be, so that we could end up with maybe, right, a condensed version. I mean, we sometimes use the term dashboard, but sort of a piece that could go out to a broader audience that people would get and go, we kind of understand now. We understand what their goals were, and we understand how they're doing against those goals, right? And this may be something you could look at in about a 5 or 10 minute period and go, I kind of get it. And by the way, it's different for everywhere, so it's not the same everywhere, but just trying to figure out what that piece might be. And part of this goes back to the point of connectivity. Is there a way to educate people in a very, you know, and I don't want to say that it's simple, but in a way they could actually go, now we have a better understanding of what we're trying to do, how we're doing against them, kind of how we're tracking. And I know you guys have seen reports that are, you know, thick, and they've got all sorts of data about, you know, raising awareness and advertising equivalency or big travel numbers, all important, but is there a way to distill that down so that everybody could see something and go, we get it. And again, we don't have any ideas what that looks like, but sort of, trying to work through that. And then the last piece, of course, is ultimately determining, what are the highest priority items? Because we can't do everything. And it's been mentioned here about trying to refine the direction so that, and I think there's a lot of this is going on, so it could be reinforcement, but what are those key priorities? And in that piece, there are situations where there will be things that have come up, and it's come up today, where we may not be able, that it may not be a priority, right? And I think we need to actually articulate that this sort of came up, and it was determined that, for the next period of time, this maybe isn't going to be something we're going to be able to focus on. Maybe it's held for the future, but it's something that is not necessarily going to be a focus, because I can tell you from all the team within the TDC, if you don't watch out, there's a list of 1,000 things that, everybody is, we always talk about teaching our clients to say no. It sounds sort of bad. But what are those things that really aren't priorities? Because I guarantee you that they probably every day get asked things that they want to do and they would like to do. But then the question is, what are those top things? And how do we, as part of the outcome of this, help educate people on what those are? So those are, and then we use this term consensus and support, because what we want to do is try to make sure through all these kind of conversations and others that when these recommendations come out, as many people as possible sort of know how we got there and are able to say, okay, we kind of know how they got there. And because without support, of course, then recommendations have a tendency not to happen. And so we want to try to figure out how we can drive as broad recommendations or broad support for recommendations as we can. And think about this term that we mentioned about using the process. So we also want to make sure that there are things that you guys think about that you go, I think the best way that we can leverage this if you will, strategic process on this issue is this. And so let's present it this way so it really has the most impact. Because, I'll say this, the worst thing, and, it's something to say, the worst thing is to have another report that sits on the shelf and gathers dust. Right? I'm sure you probably had that happen occasionally. And so we really want to work very closely with everybody to make sure that doesn't happen. And make sure we've got something it's manageable, it's realistic, but it's also, it's also aspirational. And it can be used to move some of the issues forward that we've even talked about tonight. So I want to thank everybody. I mean, this is very helpful. We've been taking notes between the two of us. And we will keep you posted. The next one is our email addresses. And if you're here tonight, we can just send everybody out kind of our V cards so you can have this. And again, I'm back to if you wake up tomorrow morning and you have thoughts, we want you to email us. We want you to tell us and keep that dialogue going and tell others. And we are going to create a way, matter of fact, we will set up a way that everyone knows how they can, send us ideas and communicate with us and that sort of thing.
Dan, one point that I would make, you've heard a lot of the issues tonight, and, obviously we do have to prioritize, but if we don't address some of these issues over the next few years, they're going to get exponentially worse, because this county is about to experience some drastic growth in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. And drastically. So if we don't get a handle on addressing now, like I said, it's just going to be exponential.
Right, and I think, to your point, how we address them, and like your point is, how do we most effectively address them so that we can, affect change? And how does how do we become catalysts for that? We got to figure that one out. Great.
To Sam's point, the the second fastest county in Florida.
Yeah. Well, no, I tell you, it's funny, just listening today, and Beth and I were looking, we've driven around a little bit. I mean, it is an interesting, in a good way. I mean, you could argue, some of the comments I've heard, we have a chance to not have kind of bad things happen in terms of, you talk about managed growth and you talk about trying to think through. The reason I was sort of hitting on this question of, I don't want to use the word brand again, but this question of how we talk about ourselves is, how does that translate into managed growth? So how does that translate into this vision of, and again, I don't want to pick on, Hampton Inns or whatever, but how does that translate somehow so people could start to get this consistent message around it that there's something we want to keep and we want to have part of our future? That was part of that, is, how do we articulate that? And there's been a lot of great things said which we've taken down today to sort of think through how that message is out there,
In your interviewing process for stakeholders, do you have the chamber down for that?
Yes, we do have them on our list.
Yeah. But again, don't hesitate to make sure that we've got people.
Out of curiosity, the strategic plan, is it a one-year strategic plan or is it longer term?
Well, the goal is multiple year, and we got to really look at how the recommendations come out, and then we'll try to plot them sort of in a Gantt chart, because we've also got, back to your point, is we've done this before, and we'll actually sit with the internal team, and we'll have, let's say there's 20 ideas. And we'll sit with them and we'll say, okay, so when do you think we can get this done? No, I'll tell you what happens. Everybody gets very excited about all the ideas, and they go, next month. And before you know it, there's 30 ideas that everybody said are going to be done in the next 60 days. So we actually try to be realistic and go, don't you think that's going to take a little bit longer? So we try to create kind of a Gantt chart that is realistic, that then everybody commits to. So that we can say that this may take a year or this may take 6 months, but we're going to commit to that time frame. So that's what we try to do in terms of how many years. That's the goal. Well, again, everyone, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you.
So, thanks. Okay.